Would you be okay with a Muslim prime minister of UK?
Yeah, absolutely. Do I think we have a particular problem in the UK with radicalized Muslims? I'm not convinced by that. You're just, picking on people because of their Muslim faith.
If you were okay with somebody who was a Muslim to become a prime minister, then they come in and they say, hey, Sharia law, what are you going to do about it?
You can't tar the entire Muslim population with the brush of potential extremism in the same way that you get Christian extremists in America who've committed appalling atrocities.
You're comparing the two?
It's the same, isn't it?
It is.
Are we really suggesting that 1.4 billion Muslims are all potential extremists? Because I don't get that sense of the Muslims I know in London. I go to a lot of Muslim countries.
Hey everyone, it's Bran here. I've got to level with you. No one saw this coming. Who would have guessed that Piers Morgan, of all people, would be the level-headed voice in a discussion about Muslim immigration? Yet, that's precisely what unfolded. Patrick Bet-David brought the usual stack of arguments, concerns about population, nods to Churchill, Sharia law debates, and welfare worries. And each of these was not just disputed, they got a reality check. The key difference was that Piers wasn't dealing in hypotheticals, he was speaking from first-hand experience. He resides in London, interacts daily with Muslim communities, and gets the subtleties that are often lost when discussions devolve into mere talking points rather than genuine dialogue. Then came the pivotal moment. Piers highlighted how the United States contributed to the destabilization of Iraq under false claims, leading to far-reaching consequences like refugee crises. When you have a hand in creating such chaos, there's an obligation that ensues. Meanwhile, as this truth was laid bare, Patrick Bet-David, a refugee to America himself, was right there. You could sense the immediate shift. It transcended a simple debate. It was an uncomfortable truth making its impact felt live. If you're into authentic conversations being put to the test, you're definitely in the right spot. So go ahead, click that subscribe button, give us a like, because here we dissect these moments as they happen. Now, let's dive in.
Is estimated Muslim population in UK by percentage from 83 till today. I'm sure you've seen this. 500,000 in 83, 1%. And then it cracked 1 million in 97, 14 years later, and then 2 million, and then 4 million, and then 4.5, some say 5 million today, 6-7% of the population. Do you think this growth, the way it's going right now, getting to 10, 20, 30%, do you think it is a good idea to keep allowing people to come in to combine the Islam way of thinking, what their ideas are, and coexist with the Western ideology?
Well, I think there are issues which are serious to be considered. For example, it's been reported there are as many as potentially 85 unofficial Sharia courts in the UK now, which are not operating under UK law. They're operating in their own law for their own communities. That clearly is not a good thing in a country like the UK. So we have a lot of Muslims who live in the UK. We've always been a very multicultural, very tolerant place. The vast majority of Muslims living in the UK have assimilated perfectly well and live perfectly peaceful and lives which contribute to society. And then you see the quite disturbing spectacle of protests, say, in London, during the Israel-Hamas war, where people are brazenly supporting Hamas in these protests. And, Hamas is a prescribed terror group in the United Kingdom. That should be not happening. The sweeping migration, much of it coming from countries that have been at war, whether it's Syria, Iraq, or wherever it may be. But you've had millions and millions and millions of people deposed from their homes or fleeing war-torn situations and sweeping across the continent of Europe and wanting a better life for their families, which I completely understand. But it has got unsustainable.
If you ask the Muslim Council of Britain, it'll say that 75% of Muslims in Britain have assimilated and see themselves as Brits.
Yeah.
I'm a Brit. I consider myself proud Brit as well, but 25% don't, depending on the numbers you look at. How would Winston Churchill today, would Winston Churchill be tolerant with the borders? Would he be like, yeah, it's okay, let him come in?
No.
Would he handle the threat? And think about how his wiring was. This is your world.
Yeah.
What do you think he would have done today?
No, I think he'd have been tough. I think he'd have been very...
In what way?
Well, I think he'd have been very protective of our borders in a way that was very protective against the threat of Nazism to our way of life.
What would Churchill have done? What do you think he would have done?
I think what would he have done?
Seriously, what do you think he would have done? Just think his profile.
I certainly think right now he would have put the clamps down on more people coming
would
in.
He have
except
sent,
in exceptional circumstances.
Would he have sent anybody back from the 7% that came here? How would he have treated some of the criminals? How would he have treated some of the some of the stuff that's going on?
So I would say he certainly wouldn't have just picked out the Muslim community. We have a lot of different religions, nationalities living in the UK. I don't think he would have singled out Muslims I think what he would have taken a more pragmatic view and gone, we have too many people in this country now. There's too much pressure on our public services. Some people are going to have to leave. I don't know why they're not sort of tougher on the French. You've got to do a deal with the French on this. You've got to say, look, sorry, you're letting all these people get on these boats. Once they're at sea, there's hardly any way to stop them. And then once they wash up on our shore, they are legally allowed to remain as potential asylum seekers.
Would you be okay with a Muslim prime minister of UK?
Yeah.
You'd be okay. That wouldn't do anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's your concern isn't that at all?
No, not at all. No, listen, I don't want to radicalize Muslim running the country. I don't want to radicalize anything running the country. There's a lot of radicalized elements of all religions, of all nationalities. Do I think we have a particular problem in the UK with radicalized Muslims? I'm not convinced by that. I think there are radicalized Muslims, and clearly the Muslim population is rising exponentially fast compared to other populations. So we are going to have to look at this and say, well, what do we do about this going forward in a way that you don't look like you're just picking on people because of their Muslim faith?
I respect the tolerance that you have of what could happen to Brit long term, because I think sometimes when you're in it and it's gradual, like the whole thing about you put a frog in a boiling water and you boil it slowly, and then boom, he's dead. It's too late, right? I think sometimes when people are in it, they're like, yeah, well, it's okay with this, it's okay with that, it's okay with this. I think UK is flirting with being tolerant, and it'd be interesting to see who would rise up and want to do something about it.
Well, look, I go to a lot of Muslim countries. I've been in Saudi Arabia. I've been in
To me,
Qatar.
the biggest thing is the extremists. It's not a...
No, exactly. Here's my point, though. But also, they have zero tolerance of people wanting to operate under their own laws when they go to those countries. For example, so the whole debate about Sharia law and so on, I can understand why a lot of Brits get exercised about that, because if I went to Saudi Arabia or Qatar or somewhere and decided I would ignore the country's laws and operate under my own laws while I was there, you wouldn't get away with it for very long.
So why would you be okay with that? Why would you be okay with that?
Well, I wouldn't.
No, but what I'm saying is, so if you were okay with somebody who's a Muslim to become a prime minister, and then say they're the noble one, right? And they're coming in, they actually love Britain, but it opens it up, and an extremist like, I want to get in, then they come in and they say, Sharia law, what are you going to do about it? Then what? Because you're making it a step ahead.
Yeah, but I don't think you can't tar the entire Muslim population with the brush of potential extremism in the same way that you get Christian extremists in America who've committed appalling atrocities. I don't assume that every Christian, I'm a Christian, I don't assume every Christian in America is a potential extremist. I just think there's got to be a more...
You're comparing the two?
No, I'm just saying extremism is extremism. Isn't it? Isn't it?
It is.
Well, it's the same, isn't it?
It is. No, I think extremism is extremism. To me, that's not the part of it. But when you look at the percentage of who is, like, for example, in America, do you remember the story about the Japanese when they went to the World Cup? What were they doing afterwards at the end of the game? They were cleaning up the arena. Everyone's like, what are they doing here? That's what we do in Japan. So would I want 1,000 Japanese neighbors? Yes, they are their own people. They raise kids. They go and work. They don't hate America. They don't get up there and commit terrorist crime. You don't hear stories like that from them. They just go and do their part, right?
But I would argue this back. Right? So I went to the Qatar World Cup, for example, for a week. Felt completely safe. There was no hooliganism whatsoever.
But that's not the same as the extremists. These are two different...
No, I agree. But again, I think there's extremists everywhere attached to all different groups. And I would say that I like the way the Middle East has been opening up in the last decade. I think it's exciting, it's dynamic. I just interviewed Cristiano Ronaldo in Riyadh at his home there. One thing he said, it just feels really safe. And it feels like it's opening up in a way that's good for families and everything else. And I think that's great. I don't like the tinge of you're all potential extremists until you prove otherwise.
No, because
I think it's unfair to a whole... I mean, how many Muslims are there in the world? 1.4 billion? Are we really suggesting that 1.4 billion Muslims are all potential extremists? Because I don't get that sense of the Muslims I know in London. I walk down my high street in London. There are Muslims running all sorts of different businesses.
Okay.
And honestly, they're not extremists.
If we look at immigrants that come to America, what percentage of them are on SNAP the most? Have you seen this chart?
No.
Food stamps by ethnicity. 45.6% of immigrants from Afghanistan are on SNAP. 42.4% from Somalia. 35% from Iraq. So why are we inviting more from Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq?
I'd need to study this in more depth, but certainly the Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, these are people, I imagine, predominantly who have fled war-torn countries. So they, by definition, when they come to America, are going to be impoverished.
Yeah,
right?
but when America was founded, it's about getting the best to come over here, right?
You fled your family
Iran. I lived there for 11 years.
From a war-torn place.
We did.
Right? So take Iraq, for example. When I was editor for the Daily Mirror in the UK, I opposed the Iraq war before, during, and after it. Cost me my job in the end.
Yep.
After 10 years running the newspaper. But I think I was vindicated by what happened afterwards. That war was fought on a false pretext. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They never found them. So and also there was this kind of subliminal, we need to respond to 9/11. We can take out Saddam. I never saw that connection. It seemed to me completely wrong. So I look at Iraqis, right, who were displaced by a war, which many people, including me, would say was an illegal war in their country that caused utter devastation. And they come to somewhere like the United States, which has been the home for people like that ever since its inception, and is lauded around the world for that, for being a place that you can come to, right, from places like that. But is there not a particular duty of care? Maybe you don't think there is, but is there not a duty of care to people who come from a war-torn place like Iraq, where the United States, along with the UK and other countries, waged that war, in my view, completely wrongly, in a way that caused their displacement, caused them to lose their homes, maybe lose their loved ones, and they come here for a better life, but when they get here, they have nothing. Now, that may explain some of those numbers. I don't know. But certainly in that case, you've got to think, well, okay, if they're the ones who are getting the SNAP benefits, okay, what is the correlation between the ones who were displaced because of the actions of the United States and the UK and the other allies that fought the Iraq War on their presence here in the United States? And is there a duty of care towards them? I don't think we should lose in the mix of all this a compassion towards genuine asylum seekers, particularly from countries ravaged by wars which we may have been complicit in starting, in my opinion, on a false pretext.
Yeah, I think that I would sit there again. I would sit there and I would say, if we're looking at anybody that's coming in, if we caused some of this, let's see what we can do about it. Now, of course, somebody in America could say, well, you caused all of it, right? Okay, no problem. But if you're coming to America and you hate America, I have no tolerance for you. And by the way, the argument, some people in America are like, look, we don't want anybody else to come in here. This is plenty, right? There are people that I've had on the podcast that wouldn't even want me to be here right now. They're like, you know, you got lucky getting in here, which is their argument. They have the right to have that argument.
How wrong is that argument?
I will tell you, like, so if somebody's born in America and they're kind of like, look, man, yeah, maybe we got lucky with you, Pat, but we got a lot of ones that came through and we didn't get lucky with that. Hate America.
I would add the caveat of the Iraq caveat, which is if you go and bomb a country and you destroy people's lives, I do think a country like the United States, most prosperous country in the world, does have a duty of care to bring some of those people into its country, as it has done with the Iraqi community in the United States.
What if that's a royal screw-up on another administration that you never agreed with them? Because Trump doesn't agree with Bush. So,
all right, let's slow this down and really unpack what just happened in that conversation, because this wasn't just another back and forth about immigration policy. What we witnessed was something far more revealing. It was a direct collision between a narrative built on fear and a perspective grounded in lived reality. And when those two things meet, when talking points are forced to stand up against actual experience, you start to see very quickly which one holds up and which one doesn't. The conversation opened in a way that has become almost predictable in these debates. A chart appears. Numbers are highlighted. Growth is emphasized. And the underlying message, whether stated directly or not, is clear. This trajectory is dangerous. This is something to be worried about. This leads somewhere irreversible. But what gets quietly ignored in that framing is history. Because if you take a step back and look at Britain over the last century, you'll find that this exact same argument has been made again and again. Every new wave of immigrants, whether it was the Irish, Caribbean communities, South Asians, or Eastern Europeans, was once presented as an existential cultural threat. Each time, the language was nearly identical, and each time, those predictions failed. Not because the concerns sounded unreasonable in the moment, but because they were rooted in fear rather than reality. What's happening now isn't fundamentally different from what's happened before. The pattern is the same. The pace of integration, the contribution to society, the gradual blending into the broader national identity, it's all following a familiar trajectory. The real shift isn't in the communities being discussed. It's in the environment surrounding the conversation. We are now operating in a media landscape that rewards alarm over accuracy, that amplifies the most extreme interpretation of data rather than the most complete one. And when that becomes the backdrop, even ordinary demographic changes start to get framed as something far more ominous than they actually are. Then the conversation pivoted into something more strategic, the use of historical figures to validate modern positions. This is where things get interesting because it's not really about history, it's about borrowing authority. The attempt is to pull a figure like Winston Churchill into the present and have him implicitly endorse a specific stance. But that only works if you can force the comparison to be narrow and selective. The moment the response broadens, when the discussion shifts from targeting a specific religious group to discussing immigration policy in general, the entire premise weakens. Because now you're no longer arguing that one group represents a unique threat. You're simply engaging in a standard policy debate that applies to everyone. And that distinction matters more than people realize, because it separates legitimate discussion from selective exclusion. Where the conversation really started to unravel, though, was around the issue of welfare and government assistance. This is often presented as hard evidence, something objective, something undeniable. Percentages are shown, comparisons are made, and the conclusion is implied without needing to be explicitly stated. But again, what's missing is context. The countries being referenced in those statistics are not just random points on a map. They are regions that have experienced prolonged instability, conflict, and in many cases, direct involvement from foreign powers. When people leave those environments and arrive in a new country, often with very little, it is not surprising that they require support. In fact, it would be unrealistic to expect otherwise. So when those numbers are used without that background, they stop being informative and start becoming misleading. They shift the focus away from the causes of displacement and place it entirely on the individuals experiencing it. And that's where the narrative becomes distorted, because it turns a consequence into a characteristic. It frames struggle as identity rather than circumstance. And once that framing takes hold, it becomes much easier to justify exclusion, because you're no longer dealing with people. You're dealing with a perceived pattern. Then came the moment that changed the entire tone of the conversation, because up until that point, everything had been somewhat abstract. It was about data, about policy, about hypothetical outcomes, but suddenly it became personal. And when that shift happens, the conversation moves on to a different level entirely. Because now, the argument is no longer being evaluated purely on logic, it's being measured against lived experience. When someone who has directly benefited from the opportunities of a country begins to argue against extending similar opportunities to others, it creates a kind of tension that is difficult to ignore. Not because it's unusual, but because it forces a level of reflection that the original argument wasn't designed to withstand. That moment exposes something deeper than disagreement. It reveals a disconnect between past and present, between personal history and public position. And when that disconnect becomes visible, it doesn't just weaken the argument, it changes how the entire exchange is perceived. The confidence shifts, the framing starts to feel less stable, and suddenly, what seemed like a strong position begins to look much more fragile. Finally, there was the broader concern about political power. The idea that a single individual defined by their religion could fundamentally alter the structure of an established democracy. On the surface, it sounds like a serious concern, but when you break it down, it relies on a misunderstanding of how modern political systems actually function. Democracies are not governed by individuals acting in isolation. They operate through institutions, through layers of accountability, through legal and constitutional frameworks that limit what any one person can do. The idea that someone could simply override all of that and impose an entirely different system ignores the complexity and resilience of those structures. It turns a hypothetical scenario into something far more exaggerated than it needs to be. And that brings us to the core of what we saw. This wasn't just a debate where one side had better points. It was a moment where a certain type of argument was pushed beyond its comfort zone. Because fear-based narratives depend on simplicity. They depend on reducing complex situations into clear emotional conclusions. But the moment you introduce context, history, and real-world experience, that simplicity starts to break down. The edges become less defined, the certainty fades, and what you're left with is something that no longer feels as convincing as it did at the start. That's why these moments matter. Not because they change everything overnight, but because they reveal how these arguments actually perform when they're tested in real time. And more often than not, when they are tested properly, when they are forced to engage with reality instead of remaining within an echo chamber, they don't hold up. And that's exactly what happened here. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a real-time stress test. And once those arguments were pushed beyond headlines and into actual context, they started to fall apart piece by piece. Because when you strip away the framing, when you remove the emotional shortcuts, what you're left with is something that has to stand on its own. And in this case, it didn't. Now, if you appreciate breakdowns like this, where we cut through the noise, challenge the narratives, and actually get to what's real, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Because we're not just reacting over here, we're analyzing, we're questioning, and we're holding these conversations to a higher standard. Drop a like if this made you think, share it with someone who needs to see it, and stay locked in. We're just getting started.